Before I begin, I'm Liz. I'm an animator. I've been animating for close to 15 years now. And I recently was able to work on a VR project. Um, and I learned a lot, so I want to share tips, tricks for how to think about VR when you're on your animation project. Before I get into the VR part, I want to point out how animation principles don't change across mediums. There are, of course, tips and tricks to work within each type and style of animation, but I'm not going to get into the weeds on those. But no, for VR, these again are tips and tricks. How immersive VR is and what draws people to it. With any medium, what is the story you want to tell and what you are trying to say are two questions we should always keep in mind. With VR, because it is a limited audience, we should always be asking, why VR? For a number of experiences, VR is used to put the audience in someone else's shoes. Traveling While Black, Carnegie Arena are great examples. They use this in their storytelling. This documentary style pushes the audience to feel and experience something they may not have had an opportunity to feel and experience. We are being put in the shoes of someone we should empathize with. It's a great storytelling tool. Traditional theater has been around for a good amount of time, and there are some impressive things we've done to set the stage. We've learned over the years how to direct the audience to look and take notice of one part of the stage, while the other part might be in the process of being set up. Sometimes it's a lighting change, or the curtain is drawn, or a backdrop lifts and to reveal a much larger stage. Sometimes the actors walk in with their set pieces. There are lots of tricks used to help bring attention to where attention should be. In immersive theater, stage techniques are used, but the audience is now on the stage as well. How the actors move around and take into account where people might be is an impressive show. Part theater, part improv. And these actors know just how to move to convey that where they need to go. Right where you are. If you get a chance to see an immersive theater piece, I highly recommend going. It's kind of hard to do right now because of COVID, but if you ever get a chance, go. Sleep No More in New York is probably the most well known. It is not the only one. It's definitely an experience that is hard to describe. At Wolves, we worked with an immersive theater company, Third Rail Projects, based out of Brooklyn. So if you ever please Google all of these. How do you storyboard or plan for VR? Since there is no camera, storyboarding might seem like a huge pain point. How are you supposed to possibly show what is going on when there is no camera? How do you show composition? What do storyboards look like when dealing with VR? It's a question that has no single answer, and I've seen many ways that people plan, storyboard, previs. It's all of the things. It's not a simple answer. For VR, there is no correct way to board. For some VR experiences, the action and characters are in one general direction at any specific time. Forward, if you would. You could board these types of VR experiences more traditionally. They're obviously in front of you. The camera may change slightly depending on how someone is standing, if they're sitting or if they're standing up. If they decide to lie down on the ground, it will change how the camera looks, but the general composition can stay not the same, but similar. For others, the characters and action is happening all around. These types are more difficult to board, but not impossible. When thinking about the pre-production phase for characters, development is key. With or without boards, understand your character or characters is going to be extremely important since you won't have traditional boards to reference. On Wolves, though we did not have storyboards, we did have character sheets, and we spent a good amount of time developing our characters. That meant creating many facial poses as we could to reference throughout Wolves. Our facial library was a great starting point for our animators to utilize. And because we didn't have locked cameras, even though we had that library, we used it as a foundation to build up from. Just because a pose looks and works well at eye level does not mean it's going to work well once our character is sitting on the floor looking up at us. As for broad body movement, poses matter, but a pose up close will look different and feel different than a pose 15 feet away. For Wolves, we relied on third rail projects to help us choreograph those movements, and it is choreographed. There were several rehearsals and back and forth with the director on what was working and how they wanted the audience to feel. The actors took our base, our foundation, and expanded on what we could do. And the rehearsals were filmed and then edited as reference. We have some people would call it a boardomatic, but because it was live filmed reference, we have the actors coming and entering in different directions. And our camera was the audience, the player at center, and would move based off of where we wanted our attention to be drawn. So it was extremely useful, extremely important that we had this. And it also helped us understand where our pain points were going to be. Whenever you get a chance, act it out, right? Reference is super important. Any animator can tell you that. How do we map out where our character is and where they are going? We used top-down view to map out where our character was and where they were going. If you can imagine a blueprint of that 1, 2, 3 bedroom apartment, that's what we did. We laid out where everything would be placed and where our characters would be at the start and at the end of each scene. So we could have the scenery transition around her instead of her leaving and walking into a brand new scene. On Wolves, we focused on Lucy, where she was, and we designed the set around her movements. That doesn't mean we didn't start building sets beforehand. We definitely made sure that we had an idea of what our sets were going to look like. So it was a general look, and we would have maybe a table or a chair, a couch, and based off of the actor and what they were doing, we maybe shifted things so that Lucy's actions, the actor could really just do what they're best at and act and not have to worry too much about where something was placed in 3D. That said, on a mocap stage, when you do have actors interacting with a couch, a table, you want there to be a couch and table. But we were also very flexible with where things were placed. So plan, but also understand that you have to be flexible in order to get the best performance you can. And really to make your project as seamless as possible. Our blueprint was a foundation, but it was also flexible. So my advice is to plan as much as you can, but be prepared to change everything. We also had to film ourselves to figure out some design issues we were having. There is one scene where there are 4 humans and 4 wolves all running around. We knew how everything was supposed to start and where everyone was supposed to end up. The middle was a big question. So we went out into the parking lot, drew the player circle, which is just a circle on the ground with someone standing in the center, so that we knew how close we were to the player, to the audience. And we set up a camera on someone. We set up someone's phone up high to look at us running around and see a bunch of people running around. An outsider might think this looks like utter chaos. It wasn't. We all knew which role we had, even though the characters were running. We walked it out first, and we based our movements off of each other. If we saw someone was going to be in the way of someone's path, we adjusted, and we rehearsed that a few times. And we then took those paths, drew out actual blueprint of where those paths would be, and set that up on the mocap stage for the actors. And even then, we adjusted. So we planned, adjust, plan, adjust. And of course, even though, we planned, we still had to make last-minute adjustments for the mocap stage. Not all scenes were this complicated. Most were pretty straightforward. One character, where do they enter the scene or room, and how does the room appear around them? Where are they in this space? Speaking of spaces, when you're designing your animation with VR and someone in the player, in the audience position, you have to think of their personal space, right? So there are 3 different types of spaces. Intimate space is really close up. It's think of hugging very close to a person. We try to avoid that with VR, mostly because if you get that close, the character is right there, gets that close to you, the basic human instinct is to like retract and like pull yourself away. So try not to get too close. The other space is personal space. And this, if you think of it within arm's range, and you want to make sure it's not too close. So it's arm's length. And you can enter this space, your character can enter this space, but be careful with big movements. If your character all of a sudden runs up to the person in VR, to the audience, and they're not ready for it, they're going to pull back. And it's possible that that's the reaction you want. But in general, we kind of don't want to scare people too much with our characters, right? We want them to feel comfortable. We want them to enjoy. But understand that you don't want it to be too close. So personal space is a good area, but you don't want to, it's the same rules, but you can bend them a bit. But you want to make sure that the audience is comfortable. So maybe in that space, your movement for your character is not these big grand gestures. Maybe it's more subtle. Maybe it's how normal people interact with each other next to each other. If you can imagine your friend standing next to you, what's an okay and acceptable movement for them? If you can imagine someone who's 20 feet away, who's trying to get your attention, yeah, maybe it is that grand, big movement. So be aware of distance. And if you have a character running up to you, maybe they slow down those last couple of steps so that they're not going to run into the audience. Speaking of subtlety, in VR, because we are maybe very close to a character, we have to take into account how people react. So let's say your character decides that they want to whisper to you, and they're going to get really close. How do they do that? Do they jump towards you, or do they like slowly move in and I need to tell you a secret, right? So how how you plan that? How do you feel like it's an invitation versus just, do you want your audience to lean in? Do you want them to just stand and watch? So how interactive do you want them to feel in this? If you want them to come closer, maybe don't go all the way in, right? Maybe have your character stop at a certain point so that they have to lean towards your character. It's a lot to think about, and there's a lot of subtlety that we didn't know we needed for wolves. There's a good amount of interactivity for wolves on the walls. You're handed some things, some objects from our character, and some of them she hands them straight to you, forward, right in front of you. But there's a great section where she's looking through this chest and she doesn't necessarily have, she's trying to look for something and she's not looking at you at all. But the actor on stage did something so brilliant that no matter who she hands an object to, every single person we play tested, every single person would grab for it. And it was this connection that we couldn't have predicted, but somehow the actor knew. They just understood how people react. And so she's not looking at you at all, and she just hands you something. And you're like, oh, I had the reaction to grab that. Like, it just felt like such a natural motion. So we don't always have to stand up front and center to hand an object to someone. We can play around with how we do that. And so when you're planning your animation, when you're really thinking about it, like, try different things, but also play test. You want to see how people react to your different animations. And playtesting can be as simple as, it doesn't have to be in VR. It could just be acting in real life with a friend and seeing their reaction. Because VR is so personal, it is so, it's a one-person show, right? Like, the person you are creating this animation for, it is an individual. It is not a huge audience. So how does one individual react? And don't just try it with one person, try it with like everyone in your family and see how they react. And that's kind of the best way to like start playtesting, start understanding your how your animations can play out. And so when we were building our animations and we thought we knew what we were going to do, we play tested in real life, but then we also play tested in VR. We had people come in and see what their reactions were. And there was one section we were having troubles with because nobody was taking the objects that were handed to them. And we were just like, so what do we do? How do we get people to interact? How do we progress the story with people not taking these objects? So we had to change up how that section went. And so we ended up creating more animations for our project than we thought we needed. And it shows you that playtest early and often and see where your problem points are. And this was a design issue, but it was also an animation issue. Like, how do you get people to take something that is like placed in front of you? And so we want people to grab for things, but maybe wiggling something in front of you, that's not the reaction you're going to get. You're going to swipe it away. So that created a different chain of animations we had to make. So plan, but also playtest. I can't stress that enough. The next thing I want to talk about is staging and camera. VR has no specific camera. It's wherever an individual chooses to stand and whatever direction they choose to stare at. So whatever they look at. A big thing with VR is once someone's in there, the first thing they do is look around everywhere, right? And the other thing they do is look straight up. So for some reason, it's amazing. We have the sky above us, but in VR, we have to see what's above us, and it's instinctual. So for cameras in VR, I feel like I've mentioned it a bunch, that there is no camera, right? There are a few ways, though, to get people to look in the direction you want them to. One way is with color and saturation. You can have the whole set black and white, and then there's color where you want them to look. Another is sound. Spatialized sound does wonders. People hear something, and it's subconscious that they look in the direction that they hear it. We could also use different lighting cues, effects, maybe an animated character or object. Directing the audience to look in a specific direction so as to not miss what you want them to see can be extremely difficult. Most people will look all around them, like I said. In Wolves, we used a few different techniques. We used spatialized sound, lighting, and vignetting the scenes. Certain areas would pop up and the rest of the set would be in total darkness. Essentially creating a spotlight for people to look at. Very much a traditional theater technique. And with that, there's also ways to do that with your character animation. Those are all other ways to get people to look. If you have a character that is like looking in one direction and you see them and notice them, and then they walk in front of you and across you, you're gonna look the way they're walking. That direction is bringing your eye to where they are going. So be aware of personal space and where they're walking. I've seen some projects where the character arcs around a very specific place. They don't come into the personal space. But you can have that character walk into the personal space. Be careful. You don't want it to be too close, but you also don't want it to feel like there's too much movement. You don't want them to overtake you, right? So be wary. Test it out with your friends and family in person, and then test it out in VR. Have a character come that close and see how people do with that movement. Block it out, as it were. You don't have to have it like finely animated in order to get that feel. You would be surprised how many people are very comfortable with the character walking across them. Just no big movements, right? And speaking again of camera, I like to say that the bigger the gesture, the bigger the character is moving, the farther away you want them. Think like a wide shot or a medium shot. How much is their body actually moving, right? For like a medium shot, their feet are probably planted and they're just like wiggling around, right? For a wide shot, they could be doing cartwheels. they could be doing a lot more bigger movements. And for a close-up shot, they're maybe moving their shoulders. They're staying pretty like on their mark. They're not like, because if you start doing that, unless you want to show off a very like anxious character, people do tend to step back. So be aware of your distances there. And the farther back you have a character, the more you have to read. So if the character looks this big to you in the distance, they need bigger facial expressions, right? I always like to like point out like stage theater. A lot of the actors' movements on a stage, they're not meant for the people in the front row. They're meant for the people in the back row, right? What they do on stage has to read all the way back there, like all the way up in the nosebleed section. So you really want to like play to that. There is no camera there, right? Like on a theatrical stage, there is no like, well, there's several cameras and it's in each individual seat, right? So you just want to be aware of that. And yeah, I think I'm running up on time. I did want to talk about the pros and cons of keyframe versus motion capture. I think people already know those already. Like keyframe, you have a lot of ability to, you hit those poses and it's really freeing. It's, you know, there really are no boundaries. You have full range of what your character's poses look like. But the cons are you probably maybe need a very large animation team. For mocap, the iteration cycle is much quicker, right? Like if something happens on the stage and then someone sees something and like, well, maybe if we do this, you can take multiple takes and then make a decision later on which one you want to follow through with. And even if you use motion capture as just reference, it's really easy to fastly iterate that way. Cons in motion capture can be that it's cumbersome. Like the amount of editing you have to do with mocap can be mind-boggling at times. And then characters have different proportions than their actors. For wolves, our characters have these very large heads. So if a character raised their arm, you know, we had to do a lot of editing and retargeting so that that arm would not go through their head. So there's lots of pros and cons. Whatever works best for your project, I highly, I like both. I think mocap's a style. So yeah, and that's my talk on Animation for VR. I really hope you enjoyed it. If I didn't say my name before, my name is Liz Kupfer, and it's been fun.